Hasan's a clown. Richard Wolff's a clown. You shouldn't listen to either of them when it comes to foreign policy. Neither of them seem to know what they're talking about when it comes to Ukraine. They would both be doing better. Dude, I don't know if these guys could organize a picnic, let alone organize a good conversation about Ukraine. That was pathetic. That was pathetic. He said something that is verifiably false. Verifiably false. H3 sub pissed at Wolff getting away with Russian propaganda. Ukrainian post gets top post of the year, probably. Top post of the year. Top post of the year in the in the Reddit. That's saying something. That's saying something. Top post of the year. Okay, let's check this out. So, for those of you who don't know, the podcast they're talking about, not the H3 Productions show, but there's a podcast called Leftovers between Hasan and H3, and they had Professor Wolff on recently. Now, I didn't watch this podcast appearance because, like, Richard Wolff doesn't tickle my fancy that much. Sometimes I'll listen to what he has to say about co-ops, but besides that, I don't really pay attention. I also don't watch H3's podcast. I don't really watch his content. I don't really watch much of Hasan's content either. And so I had no reason to watch them both when they came together. But there was a big post about Ukraine on the Reddit. Let's see. What is this? I cannot watch Leftovers because of how Hasan talks about Ukraine. Oh my God. I have a Reddit account for my job, and because every once in a while I will scroll like non-credible defense or some other nerdy Reddit boards, but this has a lot of awards. The Platinum Award, this has a lot of Reddit updates, huh? The Doom Award, I don't even know. A Sense of Impending Doom. There's a lot of different types of Reddit awards. Anyway, a lot of Reddit awards here, so apparently it really won the favor of the updating community. First, just want to say I have no issues with Ethan or crew. I love the pod, and it has been keeping me going through really tough times. Ethan has always been a supporter of Ukrainian people in our struggle, and it truly means a lot. This is purely a critique of Hasan and people on the left in the United States that share his views. Dude, it feels like no matter where Hasan goes, he can't stop catching flack for the Ukraine stuff, which is deserved, right? Which is deserved. For example, he said that it was an illegitimate strike by the Ukrainian government to attack the Kerch Bridge, which I don't know what military historian he talked to that said, oh, it is an illegal or illegitimate thing to target a enemy's logistics. I don't know where that came from. I really don't know where he got that opinion from. I assume he dragged it out of the idea that this bridge has also been used for civilian purposes, but once it's being used for military purposes and to transport military equipment, it can become a legitimate military target. There was also the fact that he said the annexation of Crimea was justified. I have yet to hear of him rolling back that opinion. He doesn't really talk about it anymore. He, of course, was extremely bold about the prediction that there was not going to be a Russian invasion of Ukraine. In fact, he was uploading videos which were like titled like day 3 or day 4, and he would change it every day, of Russia not invading Ukraine. He was trying to, dunk on the American national security establishment, and somehow Hasan messed up so terribly that John Bolton himself could have been the one dunking on Hasan. He, of course, has admitted since then he was wrong, but so has everyone who was like slammed into a wall that day. So his record on this war has not been fantastic. But apparently this is something else, and this is from within the Hasan H3 sphere. I would imagine that, I mean, I guess I don't know why I'm surprised by this. I guess I would just assume like Hasan goes into a friendly community, they're all going to welcome him with open arms no matter what he says. But, that's a very shallow analysis on my part. Let's see. Obviously, this writing will be emotionally will be emotional, and will discuss the war in Ukraine and use potentially graphic language, so read at your own discretion. I am Ukrainian. I have lived abroad for 15 years now. 5 of those were in Russia, not out of my own desire, but just how cards have been dealt. I left Russia in 2014 when they invaded Ukrainian territory. I'm not going to sit here and tell you the stop story of my life. Compared to most Ukrainians, I have it pretty good right now, but the toll that the war took on me and my family has still been massive. Fortunately, I have been able to get all my friends and family to safety, but hearing of people who grew up in the same neighborhood with or seeing photos of my hometown destroyed is fucking rough, even if I am personally safe. The thing that pisses me off is that Hasan is a part of the American left and has consistently been completely ignoring the humanity of Ukrainian people. Oh my God, Jesus. And our right to self-determination. They do not understand the historic and cultural context of the war. They view it through an exclusively American-centric lens. Damn, man. The thing is, I remember I interviewed Anastasia. Anastasia is a Ukrainian woman who is living in the Kharkiv Oblast. She's fantastic. She's done a lot of aid work. And I interviewed her about, how the West views the war in Ukraine. And she diverted to talk about Hasanabi specifically, of her own fruition, by the way. I didn't before the interview, hey, I really need you to talk about Hasanabi. She mentioned it and then brought it up later in the interview. She mentioned it off camera and then brought it up again on camera. Now, she had a very negative response to how Hasan has dealt with the war, whether it had to do with his comments about Crimea or his initial predictions about the war or how he's analyzed the war. And I remember Hasan always being somebody who, well, I don't remember him always being somebody, but he has claimed to be somebody who's really good at taking criticism. That video was not received well. I think that was actually the video that got me booted from the Hasan Discord. Now, the thing that's interesting is I've never even been active in the Hasan Discord before. I've never posted in the Hasan Discord. I never even touched it. But it was posting that interview where a Ukrainian criticized Hasan got me booted out of the Hasan Discord, which I thought was just unbelievably immature. Because, if there was a problem with something said in the video that was factually inaccurate, somebody could have reached out to me and been like, hey, this Ukrainian woman was misguided. Probably wouldn't have looked the best to tap me on the shoulder and say, please tell your Ukrainian interviewees in the war zone to be nicer to Hasan. But it was it was just a really weird moment. I didn't really care too much because I'm not active in Hasan's community. I don't really care much about it when it comes to talking to people within it or being in the Discord. But it really just showed me how thin-skinned, not even necessarily Hasan is, but the people who moderate his community are. It was very strange. Ukrainian people want the war to be over more than anyone. I promise you, we never wanted this war. We never provoked it. Hasan and Richard Wolff talking about peace talks as if Ukrainian people don't fucking want peace is infuriating. Do you think we want to be ethnically cleansed? Do you think we want our schools and hospitals bombed? Do you think we want our young people dying on the front lines instead of living a thriving life? Russia has been an imperialistic country for centuries. It is trying to claim Ukrainian land and people many times throughout our history. From the empire to the USSR, we have been killed in mass mass directly or indirectly as part of Russian imperialist projects for centuries. My great-grandparents died in the Holodomor that is now recognized as a genocide by Russia against the Ukrainian people. My grandparents' family died in World War II when Ukrainians and Belarusians were used as meat shields between the Russian and German army. Our lands have been exploited to then rebuild Russia after the war, with Ukrainian people seeing none of that. Our culture, especially the culture of Jewish Ukrainians like myself, has been destroyed by Russia for centuries. We have been colonized, exploited, and killed. So tell me, now that Russia has launched a full-blown invasion of Ukraine on the fascist rhetoric of blood and soil, under a full belief that the Ukrainian people are inferior and ought to be killed, how can the Ukrainian people achieve peace? Should Russia be allowed to keep the lands it's gained and continue to ethnically cleanse Ukrainian people in those lands? Do you know what they do to queer Ukrainians, Jewish Ukrainians, ethnic minorities? No, Ukraine is not a progressive utopia. But being a queer person, I have never feared for my life in Ukraine. I have in Russia. Ukrainian people who live on Ukrainian land choose to protect it. The 7 million people who ran are mostly mothers with their kids, disabled people, and older people who can't fight. You cannot use the refugee number to claim the majority of the country doesn't want to fight. And those of us abroad are organizing and helping our fighters in what other ways we can. Wait, was this legitimate? No fucking way. You're not, no. It was not said on the Leftovers podcast. I refuse to believe this. This would be ridiculous if they didn't check this. That because there was a lot of refugees, the Ukrainian people don't want to fight. That wasn't claimed. He used that argument? You're fucking kidding. Does anybody have a link to this? That is okay. So just because a lot of people flee as a refugee does not mean that if you were to ask those refugees, do you think you should try to win the war or struggle against the invasion, that they would say no. If you ask most French refugees fighting against the Germans, I doubt that most of them would say, no, surrender, let the Germans take over the country. They probably would. In fact, I've talked to a lot of these refugees, and a lot of these refugees, some of them express regret at not being able to be back home and fight. Many of them have been displaced because their homes are destroyed and they have nowhere else to go, but they still believe that Ukraine should keep up the struggle. Many of them are wives who have left to protect their children, but then when I talk to them, they wish nothing but the best for their husbands back home fighting. In fact, I actually have a few of these interviews with refugees in Poland recorded where they give me they express this exact sentiment. You cannot point to a refugee number and say that proves that they don't want to fight. That's very silly. Can somebody send me the link on the if Richard Wolff said that in my opinion, that puts a huge smudge on his reputation if he actually said that genuinely. Oh my goodness. Ukrainian people who are fighting Russia right now understand that the dispute is not over territory. It is over our right to existence. Russia will not stop its war, even if Ukraine gives away currently occupied land. It's because Russian war is motivated by nationalism, fascism, and imperialist expansion. I lived in Russia when they attacked Ukraine in 2014. The propaganda machine there is insane. The state control there is crazy. And it only got worse since I left. Little kids were telling me that Ukrainians should be slaughtered because they are inferior. So when I hear American leftists like Hasan talk about peace talks, it makes me angry. Okay, big brain, tell me how you'd run peace talks with Germany in 1939. Do you think you can reach a logical peace deal with a man who bases his worldviews on racial and ethnic superiority? Or maybe you can tell me how people in the Middle East who were invaded by the United States should have just given up their territory so we can achieve peace in the world faster, because no one likes fighting and war profiteering. I don't care how much of your takes are drowned in economic jargon and progressive rhetoric. When you talk about the war in Ukraine and you say, of course Ukrainian people want X, but you are disregarding the humanity of Ukrainian people. You are treating us as a geopolitical project. Let's be honest. The US supporting Ukraine has not been the reason behind why your domestic politics is shit. It has nothing to do with why you don't have free healthcare and your country is falling apart. Okay, the country is falling apart, but I get the point. Helping Ukraine is a fraction of the US budget. So miss me with the, we can use this money on bullshit. US is not helping Ukraine out of the kindness of their heart. We know that. But the other option is the destruction of our people. So better help from US for wrong reasons. The reality is that the United States and the rest of the world is not helping Ukraine enough. The economic sanctions were not strong enough. The supply of equipment is not good enough. The reality is that yes, the weapons manufacturers don't want wars to end, so they won't give Ukrainians everything we need to defeat the Russian military quickly. For the war to end, there has to be one of two outcomes. The Russians take over most or all of Ukrainians and kills every Ukrainian in that land as part of their imperialist project, or the world has to get its shit together and give Ukraine an actual necessary amount of support to defeat Russia instead of just enough to keep the war going. And when I say defeat, I mean taking back Ukrainian territory and establishing non-aggression protocols, because no one in Ukraine besides 3 crazy people wants to invade Russia and destroy it. People just want their homes back. I hate that people who think so critically about domestic issues in the United States are so ignorant on foreign policy. For the last 1+ year, this has been a never-ending string of bullshit takes. I can't interact with most American left because I never know when a person will just absolutely devastate me with their indirect but very much implied support for Russian aggression. I hate it. Americans, educate yourself on foreign politics. Don't do this shit. This is pretty devastating. You can feel the emotions that are coming off of this, off of somebody who's genuinely frustrated at having a bunch of Americans who haven't been paying too much attention to the conflict, or haven't done the time to go look at a lot of the history, commentating on it. I couldn't imagine, because the thing is, as much as I'm like in Ukraine and I'm recording, I'm not Ukrainian. This is not the country that I grew up in. These are not the communities that I, once everything is said and done, I'm going to live in until the day I die. So there's a certain connection that I just cannot, no matter what I do, have with the land and the people here, right? Now, I couldn't imagine having that connection. I already get angry enough hearing a lot of this bullshit as is. I could not imagine having that connection and hearing something like, oh, the Ukrainians don't want to fight. Even though there is clear polling data showing that the vast majority of Ukrainians are willing to continue to struggle until they have their territory back. It's like, we're talking about like 82, 83%, like the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians. Overwhelming majority. And we have that polling data readily available, and we're just going to use the refugee data to try to extrapolate from it that, oh, if you're a refugee, that obviously means that you don't think Ukraine should struggle, they should give up. It's silly. It's honestly silly. Does anybody have the link to this podcast? Do I have to look it up myself and find it myself? I think I might have to find it myself. Is this it? Okay, we got it. He said he calls it in about 27 minutes in. Okay, let's go check this out. Okay. When did they start talking about this? Let me check. Not sure exactly when the comments about refugees happened, but Wolf calls in about 27 minutes in. Okay, well, let's show transcript and we'll look up refugees and we'll find out if they actually said this, because if they did, I mean, that's I can't seem to find refugees. Maybe I can find fight for don't want to fight. Capitalist Christian countries. No, that's not what I want. Majority of Ukrainians want to keep fighting this fight, but ultimately we have to. Okay, here we go. God, where do they start talking about Ukraine? Is there like a growing defense budget, increased stock buybacks, why are Americans docile? No, there's nothing marked with it. Zelensky's war goals are maximalist and unrealistic. I mean, we're saying they're maximalist, but it's literally, we just want what Ukraine had 8 years ago. Like, oh my God, that's so outrageous that Ukraine would want what is considered by the vast majority of the international community as their internationally defined borders. Like, if we went to war with China and they like took California and Washington State and occupied it for 3 years, would we say that America wanting those back, that's maximalist goals? The maximalist goal for the Ukrainians would be, we're going to take Moscow, we're going to take everybody out of the Duma, and we're going to place them all in prison for 50 years for crimes against the Ukrainian people. That is what I would consider a maximalist goal. But even one that would be understandable when you consider the large-scale murder pits that Russia's filled up across the country. At about 43 to 45 minutes, okay, bet. Okay, we can listen to it there. 43 to 45 minutes, let's hear it.
You ought to outgrow. You're going to be making one mistake after another, and people like you and me are going to be talking about them, even though we would wish we didn't have to.
And I feel
so your answer is collaborative multipolarity, like leaning into that with all of the other hegemonic powers, or at least like superpowers that are growing at a rapid pace.
The propaganda, though, that I think a lot of people consume in America is that these countries are not willing to work with us. It's them that's putting up the roadblocks.
But they are working with us. We're working with them all day, every day. I mean, we have no commerce without China.
Listen, let me give you a couple of just simple statistics. Throughout the entire anti-Chinese or China bashing or whatever you want to call it of the last 8 or 9 years, beginning at the end of Obama, right through the tariff and trade wars of Trump, and now the continuation under the neocons working with Biden. Throughout that time, the trade between the United States and China goes up every single year. There's a peculiar disconnect between, if you pardon me, the roaring bullshit from the politicians and the underlying reality that we need them. We need them to produce consumer goods. If the American people had not been able to buy cheap.
I mean, my belief is that that trade with China is good for the world economy. I think that, you know, cooperation with one of the world's largest economies is obviously good for us. It's good for them. It's good for the world. It's part of the reason that when we announced sanctions in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a lot of Chinese companies decided to drop trade with Russia and keep trade with the United States due to how massive our consumer base is. Because if there's anything anything that's true about American consumers is they love to buy things. They really, really like to buy consumer goods. And so if China likes to make them, we like to buy them. But I don't want that economic cooperation to become us becoming docile when it comes to, for example, the freedom of the Taiwanese state. That's something I'm not willing to compromise on. I don't know what Richard Wolff's position on that is, but I have a strange feeling in the back of my brain. I could just feel it just scratching there, that it would not be a pleasant conversation.
Chinese consumer goods over the last 30 years, they would have demanded and they would have gotten higher wages to pay what would have been the price if those things had been produced anywhere else. Capitalists in America are grateful, if they're honest, for the cheap Chinese goods that have made it possible for profits to go up without rising wages, because you could go to your neighborhood TJ Maxx store and buy inexpensive Chinese clothing, or to the other stores. You know,
Burns
there
is
is no
a
Amazon, there
morally
is no
corrupt, bankrupt man.
Walmart without Chinese goods. If you plot the growth of Walmart and the growth of China, you discover something. It's the same business. That China can outproduce us on everything, but they could never have gotten into the American market unless Walmart, Target, and all the others acted eagerly to be the distributor of those Chinese goods and to make a fortune for themselves along the way. Those are the realities. The rest is make-believe. Nobody wants this war in Ukraine. Above all, the people of Ukraine who are suffering beyond all words the destruction of their society. Who's benefiting out of this? I mean,
American weapons manufacturers.
Excuse me?
American weapons manufacturers are.
Yep. Yep.
It seems like those with the least to lose and the most to gain out of this are the ones that are pushing for it and pushing for the continuation of it, whether it be Boris Johnson back when he was the prime minister going into Ukraine during the first round of peace negotiations or possible ceasefire and peace negotiation talks that were happening, organized by Turkey. Or whether it be
it was the idea that the negotiations with Boris Johnson fell through because Boris Johnson went to the Ukrainians and simply said, hey, look, we're not allowing you to negotiate a peace deal, which is something that has been touted again and again and again. It's just simply not true. It's not how the interaction went down. From people who were interacting with both Zelensky and Boris Johnson at the time, none of them have been able to reiterate that timeline of events. I'm sure that there was a peace deal offered, but it seemed to not be enough to convince the Ukrainian government or Western governments that either Russia was going to stand by the peace deal and they weren't going to continue anyway despite it, or that it was enough to convince the Ukrainian people that, okay, we will accept this peace. We will accept this. We will, acknowledge the annexation of Crimea, the annexation of Donbass, the annexation of Zaporozhye, the annexation of Kherson. We'll acknowledge the annexation of Luhansk, Donetsk. We'll declare ourselves a neutral state. We'll give up all of our weapons. We'll make it so you have to invade it. If you invade us again, we'll have nothing to defend ourselves. Like, there was no deal that the Ukrainians were willing to give a thumbs up to and keep moving with. As far as from what I know about that interaction, if somebody has a resource that I have yet to see about this that disproves me, be happy to look at it.
Ned Price and numerous other American State Department officials continuously talking about how they are not interested in peace at all. Obviously, there's an argument here about what Ukrainians want, And some will say that, well, the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians want to keep fighting this fight. But ultimately, we are not giving Ukrainians everything they want. It's not like we're, implementing Article 5. We're not even giving Ukrainians F-16s. We're not training them on that. We might down the line.
Okay, so he said some people might argue. So it's not an argument. The majority of Ukrainians want to win the war. When we talk about prolonging the war and stuff like that, when people talk about prolonging the war, of course, Ukrainians want a short war. But if you mean, when you say we need to not prolong the war, is give Russians what they want, give them Donetsk, give them Luhansk, give them Zaporozhye, give them Kherson, give them Ukrainian demilitarization, give them Ukrainian federalization, give them a lack of integration with the EU, just completely remove the sovereignty from the Ukrainian people. They're not going to accept that, and they will choose continuing to fight over even half to 9/10 of those demands. The polling data lines up with that. It's not a debatable issue. That's not like a debatable question, or some people might argue this. That's just a fact. That's an undeniable fact. And how people work around that fact to either ignore what the majority of Ukrainians want, or ignore the sovereignty of the Ukrainian people, or ignore the international law that were broken, the international laws that were broken by the invasion of Ukraine. How you maneuver around these things, that's up to you, right? You could choose to say none of that matters, screw it. At the end of the day, I care more about making sure Raytheon doesn't make $1 than I care about making sure the Ukrainian people liberate the territory that mass graves are being piled up in. I mean, that's up to you, but let's not pretend that's like an argumentative or an arguable point.
I think, but so far, these are demands that they've made that we haven't conceded to. So, I think that pushing for peace negotiations on that front, with China and Russia at the other side of the table, with Ukraine and the United States of America on one side of the table, would be the quickest and most swift way to try to stop this conflict and further bloodshed from continuing.
Okay, when I hear like, well, let's go talk to the Chinese, number one, I don't know why we would even be talking to the Chinese. I guess it's because of the prospect that they might enter and send weapons to Russia. Therefore, the Chinese are at the table. But if that's the case, then like, I don't know, like, do we bring anybody who might send weapons to the Russians or have sent weapons to the Russians to the negotiating table? Like, do we bring the Iranians who have sent Shahed drones that have been used to terrorize Ukrainian civilians? Do we bring them to the table? I don't know. At the end of the day, that's a side point. That doesn't really matter. When we talk about negotiating with the Russians, negotiating with the Chinese, if the position of the Ukrainian people is, we want Russia out of our land so they stop piling up mass graves, so they do not ethnically cleanse the territory, so they do not terrorize the population and arrest anybody for merely asserting the Ukrainian identity, right? And we do not want to demilitarize ourselves, because when we do, all that's going to lead to is another Russian invasion. And anybody who says otherwise, you're a schmuck, because the Russians have done this like 2 or 3 times by now. I think you should, I don't know, learn the patterns. You get basic pattern recognition here. That's the Ukrainian position. The Russian position is we want to annex Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Crimea, demilitarization of Ukraine, making it easiest to invade next time, and neutral Ukraine, meaning that they have no alliance structures to defend themselves upon another invasion. These positions are completely at 2 other ends of the spectrum. Completely impossible to get these positions together. And by the way, one of these positions are the moral position. I don't think it's that complicated to figure out which position is the moral one. Is it the one where they want the people committing all the terror acts out of the country, or is it the one where the people committing the acts of terror get to stay in the country? Can chat figure this out? Can Hasan figure this out? So when we talk about negotiating, it's nice to just say, let's all talk. That's easy. It's easy to say, oh, we should talk out the world issues. There's a million different world issues that have been talked about endlessly, but have never been dealt with because the situation on the ground has not been tuned for peace, have not been tuned for reconciliation, have not been fine-tuned for the war to end on the terms of what the people want. In this case, the Ukrainian people being my main concern. And so when we say we need to negotiate with the Ukrainians and the Russians, what I would always need as a follow-up isn't just, oh, let's have a conversation. It's, here's what I think should be proposed. Here is what I think is a reasonable demand, and here's what I think is an unreasonable demand. But that conversation is too hard to have And that's why conversations like this never extend into that.
Well, I mean, let me just expand one dimension of that point. We now have a defense budget, depending a little bit on how you look at it, in the neighborhood of $850 billion to $1 trillion. If you take a look, it's more money than the next 8 or 9 countries in the world combined spend on their military. We have just authorized an additional $100+ billion just for the war in Ukraine. Even if you believe that one motivation for the Ukraine war is the money being made by the defense industry, we already are doing more than anyone in their right.
By the way, it is true that there are people in every single war that want to profit off of war, but if that is a real consideration, that those bastards are making money, then couldn't this be an argument against every war, every single war? Like, I was gonna go to war to defend California under, I don't know, Guatemalan territorial annexation. I don't know, random country. But that might make Raytheon happy, so you can have Guatemala. Like, it is bad if you go to war
Burns
simply to please the interests of weapons manufacturers. That is terrible. That is awful. But ever since man has sharpened stone, there has been people who have sold sharpened stones to man. And since then, there has been an interest in those people who manufacture weapons and having there be conflicts so they can sell weapons. Does that mean that every single war since the sharpening of stone, we have to be like, but the guy who sharpens the stones, he makes the quick buck? The conflict, the struggle could be a moral one to fight, regardless upon the profiteering of an industrial class who makes money off of the selling of weapons. So, I mean, it's something you can bring up, right? But it's not something that's going to have a major impact on whether I support sending weapons to Ukraine or not. The American Left, thank you so much for the tier 1.
Mind could ask to provide them with a profitable business. Over $1 trillion. I mean, I don't even think they're that greedy. They're getting a bundle, a big bundle with no opposition. Nobody opposes the defense budget. I mean, a handful of people, but it's basically trivial. The two parties that run our politics are both eager to outdo one another in supporting the defense budget. They're in very good shape. They don't need another $100 billion war on top of the gift that this one represents. So for me, I don't think it's even them. I wouldn't mind criticizing.
Evil City just said you should try to get on the podcast. There is no way in a million years that Hasanabi would say, yes, bring on Dylan Burns TV. I refuse to believe that. I just don't think he would. I don't even think he has any interest in talking to me. I don't think he has much interest in talking to people who largely disagree with him on this war anyway. So I don't know. He has yet to. I mean, this war has been going on for a year now, right? If the same talking points are still getting said after a year, like, there's been enough time to reflect. I think people have. I don't know, man. I just if he wants to, of course, but he doesn't want to.
Them if I thought it, but I don't see. They've made a ton of money by all the stuff we've shipped to Ukraine.
Have you tried? I have not reached out to Assad and asked him if he wants to talk to me about Ukraine. No, but it's a pointless effort. It is a pointless effort. I haven't reached out. Maybe he would want to, but he doesn't have any reason to. I'm a small creator who's over here in Ukraine. It just doesn't make sense for him to want to talk to me, right? Unless he's genuinely interested in my perspective.
And all of that will have to be replaced. They will get the money and the profit out of that. The budget is huge, and it got a tremendous boost. Look, I'm an economist, and two things have happened in the last year that strike.
Where's the section about refugees? Because we've got the idea that the USA is isolating itself. Do we have the section on refugees? That's the portion I'm really interested in.
Be as downright funny. We are in a supposed war against the inflation in our country. And to that end, we have a Federal Reserve, our central bank, that has raised interest rates.
Is it just me, or like Ethan just looks so bored? I don't know if this is just me, man, but Ethan looks so unbelievably bored. He looks so uninterested.
And that's supposed to slow down the spending by individuals and businesses.
I'm zoning out. True. Is there? Come on. Did they talk about refugees, or was that? I guess they didn't talk about refugees. I guess I completely missed the point. I guess the Reddit thing was wrong. Okay, well, I can't find that part of it. No, he said it. Then where did he say it? Then where did he say it? I want to move on from this, because as much as I know you guys want me to talk about other streamers, I find this shit actually quite boring. They mention it later? Okay, later. Okay, so we're going to sit here and we're going to watch the whole 2 hours of back and forth until they just mention it. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm done. I'm done with this. If you want me to see that moment and you want to prove to me that it happened, you got to send me the link, okay? Let's go 57.
The Ukraine war by saying the Russians and the Chinese don't offer to sit down and have a ceasefire. Both of those countries have done it. Maybe they're lying. Maybe they'd cop out once you started the process. But we're not in a very good position to call them bluffers if we haven't called the bluff.
I mean, if the Russians said they wouldn't invade in 2014, and then they invaded, right? And then they lied about it the whole time. They lied about invading Crimea, and they lied about the soldiers in the Donbass, right? Then we fast forward to Minsk Accords, and it falls apart due to either side not fulfilling the requests. Then we go forward to 2022. They say for months they're not going to invade. They're directly called out by the United States saying you're going to invade. Hasan laughs at the United States for saying they're going to invade. He mocks them, laughing the whole time. It's like, oh, the Russians are not going to invade. He gets tricked by Russian propaganda, and then the Russians invade, right? So it's not like, oh my gosh, you know, a ceasefire, a call for peace out of the army that did the invading and is doing the conquesting, is doing the war crimes, doing the slaughtering. Oh my goodness, so crazy. It's not that crazy. It really isn't that crazy. And we shouldn't negotiate anything without structures in place that are going to hold people accountable, right? What I'm trying to say is we should not take the Russians at their word, just like nobody should just take us at our word. We need structures in place, which is why after this war is over, there needs to be structures in place that would indicate that if the Russians invaded again, there would be American troops on the ground. There would be some troops on the ground. There would be something that's stronger than what there is currently, dissuading a Russian invasion, that would stop a Russian invasion in the future. Or all we're doing is simply kicking the can down the road, and we're saying, well, we're going to stop the bombing for 5 years, and we'll resume it 5 years from now when the Russians have licked the wounds and they're ready to do Genocide Part 2, Electric Boogaloo.
And if we're willing to sit down without conditions, why don't we say so? And I don't think you can use the argument about what the Ukrainians want, because here I'm not interested in criticizing this.
American troops on the ground? Seriously? Yeah, I mean that 100% seriously. 100% seriously. 100%. We made a commitment in the Budapest Memorandum to uphold Ukraine's territorial sovereignty. Now, we have done a lot to try to help them. We didn't really do shit in 2014. Well, we did a lot since then to try to help them. But if we're going to tell the Ukrainians, you've got to accept this peace deal, if we're ever going to do anything like that, or we're going to encourage them even to accept a peace deal, if we're going to do that, then they need to have some confidence in something that the Russians are not going to invade again. And it can't just be, well, the Russians told us so, because the Russians told us so in 2014. And the Russians told us so in 2022. So we shouldn't just say, oh, well, the Russians told us so in 2023, 2024, so we should believe them at their word. That obviously isn't enough. We need something more permanent, something held up by international monitors, something that acts as something to dissuade Russian invasion. And don't tell me that, oh, well, this isn't going to be enough, because it has been enough for Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, countries that Russia doesn't really think is legitimate anyway. And they definitely could invade easier than Ukraine.
Mr. Zelensky. But you should know, if you don't, that he has shut down opposition newspapers, opposition media, opposition politicians. He's fighting a war. Maybe you have to do that in war. But there is no way to know what the mass of the Ukrainian people feel unless you want to take the fact that somewhere between 6 and 7 million of them have left the country, and it's not that big a country, and that would not be a sign that you would want to make a big argument about, that this shows that they're in favor of fighting to the last Ukrainian, since they've made a choice not to be among those last Ukrainians that we're fighting for. So it does strike me as there's an awful lot.
If neither Hasan or H3H3 push back on this is a fucking clown show, and I don't think they're mature enough to talk about foreign policy, and they shouldn't talk about foreign policy again in the future.
A lot of accumulated evidence that we're not dealing honestly and straightly with these major problems of our society, and that's usually the sign of a society that is scared shitless, if you pardon my Spanish, and therefore is functioning with a level of anxiety that is scary to watch.
Getting back to fiscal policy and
Hasan's a fucking clown. Richard Wolff's a fucking clown. You shouldn't listen to either of them when it comes to foreign policy. Neither of them seem to know what they're talking about when it comes to Ukraine. They would both be doing better. Dude, I don't know if these guys could organize a fucking picnic, let alone organize a good conversation about Ukraine. That was pathetic. That was pathetic. He said something that is verifiably false. Verifiably false. You can look at any amount of the polling data that's out there currently. You could just, knowing anything about Ukrainian politics, it'd be easy to say the vast majority of Ukrainians want to win the fucking war and get their land back. Do you honestly think that there's a significant amount of the Ukrainian population who are just like, Crimean Ukrainians? Fuck them. Ukrainians in the Donbass? Fuck them. If they get shot and dumped in a mass grave, it isn't my business. It isn't my business. I mean, just think about this. Just reflect on yourself for a moment. If you lived in a country, let's say you live in the United States. Some country comes in and they take fucking, I don't know, they take Massachusetts, they take New Jersey, they take California, they take Idaho, they take Montana, and they start filling up mass graves, right? And they claim this territory as their own. Do you think you'd feel very comfortable saying, well, you know, I'm not in Montana. It's not me. I'm not there. Fuck them. If there's a 500, 600, 700 body mass grave in Montana, that isn't my business. Let's let them have Montana. Let them do whatever they want to the population. Rape, murder, mass terror, a cleansing operations that Russia engaged in the Kiev Oblast. And that's the word they used, by the way, going door to door, looking for anybody associated with the government or the military, taking them out, interrogate, bam, dump their body in a grave, keep going, right? It's not hard to picture that and be like, oh my God, of course I would never accept that. That is what Ukrainians are facing right now. And we don't even need to speculate. Look, if you poll Ukrainians, war, what do they want? Kiev independent. 85% of Ukrainians believe victory in war with Russia requires liberating all territories. This is 85%, but this isn't the only poll available. There's polls done by a vast majority, a ton of different organizations. Here's Gallup, in case any of you, I don't know, don't like Gallup or whatever. Here's Gallup. Ukrainian support fighting until victory. You can go into specific numbers, but the numbers are pretty overwhelming, as you can see. Pretty overwhelming. Now, I hear this argument of, well, okay, what about all the refugees? Just because somebody flees the country does not mean that they want to surrender or sign a peace agreement that means giving up their land. Women flee with children. They could still want to win the war and also want to prioritize the protecting of their children. And women should be allowed to do that in warfare. Many of the refugees that have fled are children, and they're children, so I'm sure they have opinions on the war as well. I'm sure those kids who have had their homes blown up by the Russians probably don't like the Russians very much, or don't want them to stay when they go back to the rubble that was once their home, turned into a parking lot by the Russian army. I'm sure they have an opinion, but I don't know if polling them would be the smartest move. The elderly, they didn't stay to fight because, again, they're old and frail. Many of them did stay, though. And the ones that did stay seem to also be in war zones because they have nowhere else to go. But you can't poll the refugee population just by their movement to say they don't want to be in Ukraine. I've talked to a lot of these refugees. Many of them wish they could be back in Ukraine right now and fighting, but they have to look after their children. Many of the women, in fact, wish they were back in Ukraine fighting, but they have to be there to take care of their one child because their husband's in the military fighting the Russian invasion. There is no way you can just look at the amount of refugees that were displaced and say, that proves that they don't want to continue the struggle. That is silly. That is not from somebody, that's not something I would hear or what I would expect to hear from somebody who is a professor, who is a professor who supposedly studied the Soviet sphere, which Ukraine is supposed to be in, the post-Soviet sphere, what used to be the Soviet Union. This is not something I should hear from him. And this is something that you would think after Hasan has fucked up time and time again on this issue, he would give a little bit of pushback on this, because H3, Ethan, as much as I want to put some of the blame on his feet for just like for not pushing back, and I feel like he should have given some pushback, at least I can say like he's not very involved in politics. He's not a super political guy. Well, certainly not as much as Hasan. I'm sure there's a little part of his soul that kind of just hoped Hasan, if this guy Richard Wolff, which I'm sure it was Hasan who asked to have Richard Wolff on in the first place, he would give pushback if he said anything that was out of line or was wrong or needed to have pushback against it. I mean, like 400,000 people like watch this podcast. Like thousands, hundreds of thousands of people watch this show and they hear him say, well, we don't truly know what the Ukrainian people feel, so all we can truly look for is the refugee numbers. And if you leave the country, that indicates that you want to give up and let them have your village forever. What a fucking silly position. This honestly pisses me off. I expected more from Hasan, which is saying something, because I don't expect much from Hasan on this issue, but I expected more from Hasan to push back against somebody coming on his show and disregarding the opinion of the Ukrainian people so much. He just completely dumped it. If Richard Wolff said this in central Kiev, like he would be pelted with tomatoes, right? He would be pelted with tomatoes. It would be absolutely outrageous for him to say this in the face of any Ukrainian person. And I bet you, I'll tell you this right now, he would never say this in the face of a Ukrainian person. He would never do it. Neither would Hasan, neither would Ethan, because they wouldn't let them get away with this. Like, we know what the majority of Ukrainians feel. We can see it from polling data, and we're not talking about some rinky-dink pollster. Someone would be, oh, the Kiev Independent, that's too biased. Are we really gonna say Gallup is too biased? Or that Gallup, when they were doing the polling data, they had like somebody in the room like intimidating the Ukrainian people. Get out of here. Get out of here, man. Anybody who goes to Ukraine is going to report back to you what I'm saying here, that the majority of Ukrainian people want to continue the struggle. The majority of Ukrainian people, while they would like the war to end as soon as possible, are not willing to sign away their land or their neighbors, which is how they see it, as if they were to sign a peace agreement, signing away Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. They see that as signing away their neighbors. And the idea that somebody being a refugee communicates into them wanting to sign away their neighbors to permanent Russian occupation, where no liberation will ever come, is ridiculous. And this really pisses me off. Somebody needs to shut that old man up. Somebody needs to put him in our home. Jesus, I'm done. I'm done talking about it. Oof, that pissed me off.